Earl Dorr, who had been standing at the gate of the Meaner farm in Elkhart, Iowa, watching a concrete contractor break up the old machine shed floor on the morning of April 19, 2022, said later that he didn't understand what he was seeing until Gus Meaner had been standing there reading for about 4 minutes without moving. That was the tell. Gus Meaner was not a man who stood still in the middle of a work morning for no reason. Earl set down his coffee and walked over to see what was in his hand. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. By the spring of 2022, fertilizer in Polk County, Iowa cost about what a farmer's grandfather would have paid for a tractor. Anhydrous ammonia had gone from roughly $490 a ton in early 2021 to $1,600 a ton by March of 2022. The sharpest single-year increase in the input's recorded history, driven by natural gas prices in Europe, global supply disruptions, and the particular kind of instability that farm input markets absorb before most other markets have figured out it's coming. Diammonium phosphate ran $900 a ton. Potash ran $750. A corn grower putting full recommended rates on 200 acres was looking at input costs that had more than tripled in 14 months. The Meaner farm was 87 acres in Polk County, 4 miles northeast of Elkhart, and 14 miles from Des Moines. Gus Meaner was 47 years old. He had been farming the place full-time since 2003, when his father's health made it necessary. He ran it as a mixed operation, about 30 acres of sweet corn and dry beans for direct markets, the rest in hay and a fall squash operation he sold through 3 farmers markets and a CSA with 44 members. Not a large operation, not a margin-rich one, not the kind of place that absorbs a tripling of input costs and keeps moving without noticing. In March of 2022, Gus ran the numbers on his spring fertilizer order and concluded he could not afford to fertilize at recommended rates. Not close. At 2021 prices, he had spent about $106 per acre on inputs for the vegetable ground. At 2022 prices, the same program would cost him somewhere over $280 an acre. His gross revenue from the vegetable operation in a good year ran about $31,000. The math had stopped working. He drove to the Polk County Farm Bureau Co-op in Elkhart and sat across from a man named Larry Kehoe, who had been the co-op's agronomy manager for 23 years. Larry laid out the options. They were not good options. Gus drove home with a smaller order than he needed, and a problem he had not solved. The machine shed on the Meaner farm had been built in 1941. Timber frame, poured concrete floor, functional for 8 decades and no longer adequate, cracked in 3 places from frost heave, oil-soaked where the Oliver 88 had sat for 20 years. Uneven enough that water pooled at the east end every spring thaw. Gus had been planning to break it up and pour new concrete for 3 years. He booked the contractor for April and did not think much about it in the context of anything else. The concrete crew arrived at 7 in the morning on April 19. Dale Frick, 26 years old, running a Case et backhoe for a contractor out of Ankeny, had the floor half broken and was loading rubble into a dump truck by 9 when the bucket turned up something metal that rang differently against the concrete teeth than gravel does. He stopped the machine. He reached down and pulled up a Folgers coffee can sealed with electrical tape that had dried to brittleness over the decades. The can was wrapped inside a folded piece of oilcloth, and the oilcloth had done its work. The can was intact. Gus was 40 feet away watching the pour prep when Dale held it up. He walked over. He worked the tape off with a pocket knife and preed the lid. Inside, a second piece of oilcloth folded around a set of papers. He unwrapped it on the hood of his truck. 3 pages torn from what appeared to be a University of Iowa Extension Service bulletin, annotated in pencil in small, precise handwriting. Pinned to the front of the extension pages with a safety pin was a piece of lined paper. At the top, in blue ink, L. Miner, March 1941. That was his grandmother's handwriting. Lorena Miner had died in 1974. The paper smelled of nothing in particular, which told you something about how well the oilcloth had held. Earl Dorr, who had come by that morning to borrow a cultivator tooth and stayed because the concrete work was interesting, had been watching from the gate. He saw Gus stop moving. He saw the paper in Gus's hand. He set down his coffee and walked over. He looked at the paper. He looked at Gus. "What is it?" he said. Gus said, "Something my grandmother buried." Earl Dorr looked at the paper again. He could see it was a formula of some kind, measurements, instructions, a hand-drawn diagram of a field with arrows indicating application direction. He did not ask another question, because the look on Gus's face was not a look that invited more questions right then. He picked up his coffee and waited. The Polk County Extension Office had a new agent that spring, a young man named Bryce Holman, who had graduated from Iowa State University's agronomy program in 2020. He was not the kind of extension agent who dismissed old methods as a reflex. He had done his coursework on cover crop nitrogen and knew the peer-reviewed literature. He was genuinely interested in diversified operations and came out to the Miner farm inside a week of Gus calling him. He looked at the formula. He looked at the extension bulletin. He read Section 7 of the bulletin, which Lorena had marked with double lines in pencil, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. He said that the hairy vetch component was well supported, and he had seen good results with cover crop nitrogen in current research. The compost tea at 40 gallons per acre was harder to evaluate. The science was mixed. The wood ash potassium was legitimate, but difficult to quantify without a pre-application soil test. He said the formula had what appeared to be sound instincts, but that the interactions between the biological components were unpredictable without controlled comparison data, and that a first-year trial without a synthetic backup carried real yield risk. None of that was wrong. Bryce Holman was 29 years old and competent and honest and correct about almost everything he said. He read carefully. He spoke carefully. He had no interest in dismissing something he hadn't tested. He was evaluating the formula against what a synthetic program would produce, not against the alternative, not against $1,600 a ton anhydrous, just against the standard, which was the only comparison his training had given him tools for. Earl Dorr had heard the conversation from the truck. He said later, "Bryce is a good kid. He just thought there was still a choice." There wasn't a choice. Not at $1,600 a ton. Gus spent 3 evenings in April reading Extension Service Bulletin number 234, the full document. Iowa Agricultural Extension Service 1936, published from Ames, Soil Fertility Maintenance Without Commercial Inputs. He found a reference copy at the ISU library and drove up to Ames on a Saturday morning to read the whole thing, not just the torn pages Lorena had taken, because she had underlined specific passages in pencil, and he wanted to read what came before and after each one to understand why she had marked it, and not the sentences around it. He sat at a reading table in the special collections room for 4 hours. He took notes in a yellow legal pad. He drank 2 cups of library coffee, which was not good coffee, and did not notice. He also called Howard Seifert, who had retired from the ISU Agronomy Extension in 2009 and now grew about 20 acres of vegetables near Grinnell. A librarian at the ISU library gave him Seifert's name, said he was the one who still knew that bulletin by heart. Gus called from the parking lot before he drove home. He read Seifert the formula line by line over the phone. Seifert didn't interrupt. Gus read slowly, stopping at the handwritten amendments in the margin. Seifert let him finish. When he finished, Seifert said, "That's a complete low-input biological nitrogen program. Hairy vetch and Austrian winter peas for nitrogen fixation, manure tea for microbial loading, ash for potassium, inoculant refresh at planting. All of it. Where'd you get it?" Gus told him. There was a pause on the line. "Your grandmother read the right pamphlets," Seifert said. "And she tested them. You can see that in the annotation she's crossed out the original seeding rate and written her own number. She ran trials." Lorena Miner was 34 years old in March of 1941. Her husband Walt had his draft notice. He would report to Fort Dodge in June. She had 3 children under 12, and 87 acres she was going to farm alone, or let go. She had been running the kitchen garden and vegetable side of the operation for 15 years. She knew what the Polk County loam would do and what it wouldn't, not from textbooks, but from 15 years of being responsible for it. She had made mistakes on it. She had watched what happened after. She had tried things differently the next season. She had been corresponding with the Extension Service since 1935. She had the pamphlets. She had run her trials, adjusting seeding rates and incorporation timing in small test plots, noting the results in the margins of the bulletins. She knew what worked on this specific ground at this specific latitude in this specific soil type. Not in general. On this farm. She buried the formula in March of 1941 because she didn't know if she would still be there in the fall. She wanted it in the ground in case. She buried it in the machine shed foundation before the concrete was poured. The shed was going in that spring, and the floor would protect the tin indefinitely, better than a drawer or a shelf. Whether she forgot where it was, or tried to retrieve it after the floor was poured and couldn't, or simply never needed it after Walt came home in 1945 and synthetic nitrogen became cheap in the post-war years. Nobody alive could say. She never told her children in terms specific enough to stick. By the time she died in 1974, the memory of what was in the ground had gone with her. The formula on the oilcloth was not long. Gus read it 10 times before he drove home from the April 19 concrete work, standing by his truck in the cold with the oilcloth spread on the hood. Seed hairy vetch at 25 pounds per acre and Austrian winter peas at 15 pounds per acre in September. Use inoculant on seed. Must be fresh. Apply the morning of seeding, not the day before. Turn under at full bloom in May before pods set. Wait 2 weeks before planting vegetables. Manure tea. 1 part aged chicken manure to 5 parts water. Soak 4 days. Stir daily. Apply 40 gallons per acre to soil, not to leaves, before planting. Wood ash, 180 to 200 pounds per acre, tilled in at the same time as the manure tea application. Not more than 200. More will burn the soil. Soil temperature. Do not plant until 50 degrees at 4 inches. Test with the finger, not the calendar. There was a final note at the bottom of the oilcloth in writing smaller than the rest. Added after the main formula, squeezed in at the edge of the cloth, as if she had thought of it later. The vetch does the heavy lifting. Everything else is company. Howard Seifert, when Gus read him that line, laughed once. Quiet, short. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said. The mechanism is straightforward enough once you know it, though it had been mostly abandoned in American commercial agriculture by the time synthetic nitrogen became the standard practice after World War II. Hairy vetch is a winter annual legume that, when inoculated with live rhizobium bacteria and allowed to grow to full bloom before incorporation, fixes atmospheric nitrogen in its root nodules at rates between 80 and 130 pounds per acre, competitive with moderate synthetic nitrogen applications for vegetable production. The compost tea delivers a concentrated population of soil microorganisms to the planting zone, which accelerates nutrient cycling from organic matter already in the soil. The wood ash provides soluble potassium without the chloride load of muriate of potash. The inoculant refresh ensures active nitrogen cycling bacteria are present in the seed furrow from germination forward. It is, stripped to its parts, a complete biological nitrogen cycle performed at field scale. Lorena didn't use that language. She didn't need to. The formula was the formula. Gus had caught an online listing in September of 2021, months before the fertilizer prices had fully broken, for hairy vetch seed from an outfit in Ames, and had ordered 200 pounds of vetch and 20 pounds of Austrian peas without a specific plan for it, because the price was reasonable and the crop interested him. It was sitting in the back of the barn when April came. He seeded it into the vegetable ground that fall, September 18, 2021, according to his records, with rhizobium inoculant he ordered from a seed supplier in Boone. The stand came in well. He watched it through the winter, the way farmers watch things they've planted that they're not entirely sure about. He turned the cover crop under on May 14, 2022, when the vetch was at full bloom. Not a day earlier. Lorena had been specific about that, and Seifert had confirmed that it mattered. The nitrogen content in the plant mass peaks at full bloom and declines sharply once pods begin to set. Gus walked the field before he turned it under and confirmed every plant he could see was blooming. Then he turned it. He spread the compost tea on May 28 from a 300-gallon sprayer he borrowed from Earl Dorr, 40 gallons per acre, applied in the evening when the soil temperature was dropping and the microbes in the tea would have the best chance of establishing. He spread the wood ash on June 2. He had been accumulating ash from a woodworker in Ankeny who had been giving away barrel loads of hardwood ash for 2 years because he had no use for it. Gus had been taking it without knowing exactly why. He planted sweet corn on June 6. Soil temperature at 4 inches, 52 degrees. Earl Dorr drove by on June 8 and stopped at the road. He looked at the field. He looked at Gus, who was working the far fence line. "You're really doing your grandmother's recipe," he said. Gus said he was. Earl drove on. The stand emerged on June 12, 6 days after planting, which was a day earlier than Gus's average emergence date. He walked the rows on June 15 and counted stands in 8 random sections. Emergence rate, 94%. His average over the previous 5 years was 91. He did not tell anyone that. He just kept watching. The plants grew evenly in a way that Gus noticed and that Earl noticed from the road by late June. Synthetic nitrogen in a dry spring concentrates near the application band and leaves pale, thin strips where coverage drops off. Every farmer in Polk County had seen it. The biological nitrogen, released gradually as the incorporated vetch decomposed, didn't work that way. It came from everywhere in the soil profile, because the root biomass had been everywhere. The field looked even, dark green, on schedule. The kind of field that does not call attention to itself because nothing is wrong with it. Bryce Holman drove past the field once in July. Earl mentioned it to Gus in August. Holman had slowed down, looked at the corn from the road, and kept driving. He didn't stop. That was the kind of thing a careful person does when they're looking at something that doesn't match what they expected to see, and they want to look longer before they say anything about it. The sweet corn harvest ran from August 6 through August 22. Gus had kept yield records on that ground for 9 years. His 2022 yield came in 7, 4% below his 9-year average. Below, not even below, but on ground that had received no synthetic nitrogen and no synthetic potassium and no synthetic phosphorus at all. His input cost per acre on the vegetable ground in 2022, $31. In 2021, it had been $106, which was itself a low input year. At a 7.4% yield reduction and a $75 per acre input savings, his net margin per acre was higher in 2022 than it had been in any year between 2018 and 2021. He sent soil samples to the ISU Soil Testing Laboratory in October. Organic matter, 3.4%, up from 2.8% the previous fall. Soil respiration rates, a measure of microbial biological activity, were up 31% from his 2021 baseline. Both numbers were in the range that Seifert said he would expect after one season of biological management, and neither of them would have appeared on a conventional input cost analysis, because they measured something the conventional analysis wasn't designed to see. Gus called Seifert when the results came in. He read him the numbers. Seifert listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother's formula is the same program we've been publishing peer-reviewed papers about for 20 years. It just wasn't in the format that gets grant funding." Bryce Holman called in November. He had seen the soil test results through the ISU laboratory system, and he asked whether Gus would be willing to let him set up a formal side-by-side trial in 2023. One plot with the Lorena Maynor formula, one with a standard synthetic program, soil sampling at 4 intervals through the season, and a yield comparison at harvest. Gus said yes. He said it without hesitation, which was not entirely what Holman expected. The 2023 trial ran through the full season. The ISU Agronomy Extension Office co-funded the soil sampling. By the end of October 2023, there was a preliminary data set from the Maynor farm in Polk County that Holman described in a field day presentation in Ames that November as consistent with expectations from the peer-reviewed literature on biological nitrogen fixation in annual vegetable systems, which was academic language for it worked about as well as the tests said it should. By January of 2023, 3 of Gus's neighbors had called him asking about the formula. 2 ordered hairy vetch seed that winter. Earl Dorr ordered 400 pounds. Gus Maynor is 49 years old now. He still runs the same 87 acres in Polk County. He has used the Lorena Maynor formula on the full vegetable ground every season since 2022. His soil organic matter was at 3.9% as of last fall's test. Earl Dorr keeps a photograph on his phone of the Folgers coffee can on April 19, 2022, lying in the broken concrete with the oilcloth beside it. He took it before he walked over to see what Gus was reading. He is not sure exactly why he took it. He said later it just seemed like the kind of thing that should have a photograph. He says when he looks at it now, what he thinks about is Lorena Maynor in March of 1941. 34 years old. 3 children. A husband leaving in June. 87 acres and the knowledge she had earned testing every one of them for 15 years. She wrote it down. She wrapped it carefully. She put it in the ground where it would keep. She didn't know her grandson would need it in 2022. She couldn't have known that. She just knew that good knowledge, properly preserved, has a way of finding the moment when it's needed. She wasn't wrong about that either.